Hello, and welcome to my first lecture on the moral theory called Utilitarianism. Today I'm going to give an introduction to utilitarianism and discuss one of the most important utilitarian thinkers, kind of the guy who put utilitarianism on the map, Jeremy Bentham. Prior to that, I am going to do a brief introduction to what a moral theory is. Utilitarianism is a moral theory, but that's not going to make a lot of sense to you until you know what a moral theory is. So if you already think you know what a moral theory is, you can go ahead and skip this first section. If not, I would pay attention. And even if you do, maybe this would be a good review for you. So that's what we're going to tackle today. There's going to be a second part where I go into a little more depth with utilitarianism, and I talk about the other major utilitarian thinker, John Stuart Mill. But before we get into any of the content, let's do the boring thing first. A lot of people don't do this, but I think it's important. So I want you guys to know where I gathered my information and how I prepared this lecture. I think it's kind of always important to cite your sources for things. So this is the list of all of my sources. You can screenshot it or whatever. Another reason I put this up here is because it might be helpful for you. If you're a student of philosophy and you need to write a paper, some of these sources might be great. If you just want to, dive into the primary texts, those are up here as well. So real quick, I'm going to go through these. The first is the textbook that I use for my my introduction to ethics class. It's called Disputed Moral Issues. This is the most recent edition, the 6th edition by Mark Timmons and Joshua Glasgow. It is an anthology. So there are some introductions and things written by these two guys, but there are also writings from ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, and then more modern day philosophers. And then there are a lot, the bulk of the book is on particular moral issues like abortion or the death penalty. And it's a lot of modern day philosophers. Some, of those entries were written in the past, 5 or 10 years. But I'm mainly using that in today's lecture because I'm going to kind of discuss what a moral theory is based on what Timmons and Glasgow say about it. That's sort of my primary text. The next is the book by Bentham that we're going to talk about called An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation. Now, I've never read the whole book. If you are I have a bachelor's and a master's in philosophy, and I've never read even close to the whole book. But I'm sure it would be interesting to read the whole thing. But for our purposes, for understanding what utilitarianism is, you don't really need to read the whole thing. You only need a short selection to understand his basic ideas. So what I use is this, it's just 3-4 pages. And there's a link to the selection that I use. Hopefully that stays online so that you can utilize it as well. And it's just this. The next is Utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. This I have definitely read the whole thing of, but to understand what Mill is saying, you don't need to read the whole thing to understand the basic ideas at least. So this is the book. It's not very long, but I also have a link to a shorter selection that I would recommend. Hopefully that stays online as well for free. And what's great about this selection is I've assigned this, I've posted this exact selection for my classes, is there's a ton of critical questions that they're really deep, interesting questions. And if you need to write a paper on utilitarianism, I would go look at that and look at some of the critical questions and think about them. And they might give you ideas for what to write about, or just, ideas for what to talk about in class or enhance your understanding of utilitarianism. But it is a much shorter selection than this. These are two resources I frequently use to prepare lectures and that I always recommend students use if they need to write papers. One is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I used this to kind of hone my knowledge of Bentham before I as I was preparing for this. And the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the Stanford Encyclopedia especially goes into so much depth, and you can find literally anything related to philosophy. It's all legit academic writing, and it gets really minute and really precise. This is an excellent resource. It could be overwhelming because there's so much content on there, but it's an excellent resource, and you should use, I would say you should use that for a paper, certainly, as opposed to the AI summaries and whatnot that you find. I would never use that for anything other than guiding me to something that I might use. But this is a great resource. I used this to prepare this lecture. I didn't use the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but I frequently do. This is just a link to that kind of helped me understand an idea in Bentham that we're going to talk about called the Felicific calculus. And then this, I'd never been to this site, but it's great. It's tons of free articles, goes into a lot of depth on the philosophy of utilitarianism, utilitarianism.net. And then this last link is just, I literally use that for like one quote. So that's what I used. If that means anything to you, I do think it's important to just kind of put that out there. And now let's get into the less boring stuff. Let's talk about first, what is a moral theory? What are we talking about when we talk about a moral theory? I'm hoping that I can kind of get through that in about 15 minutes. And then utilitarianism, and then the good stuff. Not that the other stuff isn't good. But, okay, so like I said, what is a moral theory? There's maybe 10 pages in this book that that deal with this question. And it is pretty important to know what a moral theory is before you start getting into individual moral theories. So, actually, back up just a little bit. Before I say what a moral theory is, what is the study of ethics in philosophy? You know what ethics is in your daily life. It has something to do with what's right and wrong. It has something to do with morality. But in philosophy, ethics is a particular branch of study. There are questions that philosophers ask when they're doing ethics. So let me just give you the most bare bones explanation of what that is real quick. There are, and people dispute this, people disagree, but I would say there are three main branches of philosophy. There are more than three, but the three main branches are metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. I'm not going to write that on there because I'm just going to be quick with it. Metaphysics, this is the real heady stuff. Metaphysical questions. When a philosopher is doing metaphysics, they're asking about the nature of reality. They're asking about what is. Is there a God would be a metaphysical question. Do humans have free will? Is reality just the material world, or is there an immaterial world? Is there maybe a spiritual world? Those kinds of, kind of stereotypical, deep questions about what's really going on here. Those are metaphysical questions. Second branch of philosophy is epistemology. Maybe I should write these up here. Yeah, I will. I'm not going to write the definition. But metaphysics, basically, I would say it is what is. That's the simplest way to put it. What's the nature of reality? Epistemology, I think mainly I wanted to write this up here because this is such a weird word, I guess, that it might be useful to see it in print. Epistemology is what do we know, or how do we know, maybe? It has to do, the main point is, it has to do with knowledge. These are questions about knowledge. Meaning, something like, an example would be, what is the difference between a fact and an opinion? How do you know what you know? And how do you know that you know it? Something like, what is truth? Capital T, truth. What is truth? What does it mean to say something's true? Can we ever know for sure that something is true? What are the limits of our knowledge? So these questions can get also really convoluted and deep. And then, of course, finally, so knowledge, nature of reality, ethics. Ethics, quite simply, is, okay, we're talking about this, what are we, what's reality? What do we know? But, what do I care? I need to know what to do. What do we do? In other words, what should we do? How should we live our lives? What does it mean to live a good life? Or also, what is good? What is it that is ultimately good? What is goodness? What is the nature? And of course, maybe the big one you're thinking of, what's the difference between right and wrong? Which actions are right and which actions are wrong, and how can I tell? So, those sorts of questions. What does it mean to live a good life? How ought I to live? How should I live? How do I know between right and wrong? What actions are right? What actions are wrong? All those sorts of questions are ethical questions, and they are geared towards action, towards how we should live our lives. So, we're doing ethics. I should say also, there are other branches of philosophy that are important, and like, for example, there's aesthetics, has to do with beauty. What is the nature of beauty and art and those sorts of things. And then logic, of course, that's the study of how we reason, and logic is very important in philosophy. But these are what I would take as the kind of the big three. And we are right here today. We're talking about ethics. So, ethics, the study of ethics, also called this, moral philosophy as well, moral philosophy. There are these things in ethics called moral theories. A moral theory is, according to philosopher John Rawls, there are two central concepts for a moral theory. There is the concept of the right, what is right, what is morally right, and the concept of the good. What is good, meaning what is intrinsically good, and how can we know what is good or what is bad, right? So intrinsically good, if you don't know what that means, it means inherently good. Something that is good for itself. So it's a question about value, about what's valuable. What is it that is good in life? And then what is it that is right in life? Those are that's according to John Rawls, so people disagree about these things. But in general, I think that pretty much covers it, right? So, there are, Timmons in that textbook, he lists 3 questions that a moral theory will try to answer. The third one, I think, is a little more advanced, and I'm not going to put it up here. I'd take the first 2 as the most important, and they're these. So let me write up here, what questions does a moral theory answer? Or attempt to answer? And like I said, I'm going to put 2 up here, but that doesn't mean that every moral theory answers both. It could be both, could be one or the other. What questions does a moral theory attempt to answer? And I kind of already sort of covered this with that quote from Rawls. These are what they are. The first is, what makes an action right or wrong? And by right or wrong, we mean morally right or morally wrong. What makes an action right or wrong? And the second, I'll go into a bit more depth here in a second, is what makes an action, or what makes, not an action, what makes something, right, good or bad? Or rather, what is good or bad? Okay, the 2 central questions that a moral theory will address, or what I see as the 2 central questions. So, first, what makes an action right or wrong? When we ask this question, we aren't asking what actions are right or wrong, right? So, we're not saying what makes an action right or wrong. Okay, an action is right if, or an action is right if it is on this list of rules or on this list of commandments. Let's say the 10 commandments, right? do not lie, do not murder, honor your mother and father, right? Let's say we're talking about the 10 Commandments. Okay, if you just say, well, an action's right if it's on this list of the 10 Commandments, that doesn't really answer the question. That gives you a list of actions, but it doesn't tell you why they're right or wrong. It doesn't tell you what they all have in common. What features of those actions make them right actions? So using that example, let's say you're a Christian and you believe that the 10 Commandments are divinely ordained rules, and that if you violate one of the 10 Commandments, you've done something morally wrong. Okay, that's not a moral theory. Why? Why are the 10 Commandments, why is violating one of the 10 Commandments morally wrong? What makes those violations wrong? The obvious answer is because God said so, right? God gave us the 10 Commandments. Whatever God says, God defines right and wrong. That's a theory. That's a moral. Now you have a moral theory. It needs to be defended, but now you have a moral theory, and that theory is called divine command theory. Whatever God says, God dictates morality. Whatever God says is what's right or wrong. Now, you could also believe that the 10 Commandments are an accurate list of moral rules, and you don't have to believe that they are moral rules, that they're morally right or wrong, that they're moral prohibitions because God said so, right? You might believe that God gave us the 10 Commandments, but the reason that those things are wrong, it's some other reason. And God is just a moral being. So God loves what is right. And God will never tell us to do something that is morally wrong, because God hates what's morally wrong. But God didn't make the morally wrong things wrong or the morally right things right. He just loves those things because they're morally right or morally wrong. Now, I know I'm getting into the weeds here. It's not all that important, but I think that illustrates a point, right? Which is that an important point. I can believe that lying is wrong. Somebody else can believe lying is wrong. Somebody else can believe lying is wrong. And yet we can all believe a different moral theory. We can all believe that there's a different reason for why something like lying is wrong, right? You could disagree about which things are right or wrong, but what's important is what are the features of those things that make them right or wrong? Another example would be like social contract theory, which is often used in like a political context as a sort of theory about how society is formed. And the idea is that a society is a social contract, meaning we agree on how we're going to treat each other. So like a society could form in that, like, let's say me and 3 other people are starting a society. I don't know, right? And I don't want to get killed, and nobody else wants to get killed. So we all agree we're not going to kill each other. Now, I've given up my freedom to kill somebody, or we're all not going to steal from each other. I've given up my freedom if we all agree we're not going to steal from one another, I've given up my freedom to not take what I want from you, but I've also gained a measure of security. I know you're not going to take from me. So we've agreed, okay, we're going to kind of give something up in order to give up some of our freedom in order to gain a greater degree of security. That's a theory about how societies form, but it also can be a moral theory as well. And the moral theory would say, it's wrong for me to lie to you, or it's wrong for me to steal from you, because there's an implicit agreement. I agree I'm not going to steal from you, and that's why I know that you're not going to steal from me. So I'm violating a contract. I'm violating an agreement that I implicitly have with you. And it's wrong to violate that agreement. We've agreed we're not going to steal from each other, and you've stolen from me. You've done something wrong because you violated the social contract. That is another explanation of what would make an action right or wrong. 2 examples. Utilitarianism is also going to directly answer this question. That's a little foreshadowing. The second question, what makes something good or bad? Well, we would need first, in order to answer this, a theory about what is intrinsically good. Again, what's inherently good. So let's say we have a theory that, like this is again foreshadowing what the utilitarians are going to say, is that happiness is intrinsically good. Happiness isn't good for some other reason. It's just good. Whereas something like money, you might say, well, money's good. What about money? But money isn't intrinsically good. If you couldn't buy anything with money, It wouldn't have any value. Its value is extrinsic. It has extrinsic goodness because it can get you something that is intrinsically good, which whatever it buys for you, maybe that thing then brings you happiness. So what makes something good or bad might be it's something that brings about happiness, right? Happiness is what is intrinsically valuable. But you could say other things. You could say love and connection, that's intrinsically valuable. Whatever enhances love and connection, right, is going to be a good thing. So me buying my mother flowers, that improves my relationship with her, and so that's what makes buying my mother flowers a good thing, right? Or you could say something like, actually power is intrinsically good. Having power is the best. It's just the best, man. It's the best thing to be powerful, to be able to rule over people, to be able to control people, exploit people. Now that seems pretty immoral, but really this could be somebody's moral theory about how we should live. We should try to gain power. Anything that enhances my power is going to be good. Anything that diminishes it is going to be bad. So there's a theory about what is intrinsically good, right? That can be part of a moral theory. And then what makes an action right or wrong. And yeah, so almost done with this moral theory topic, but real quick, I think it's important to mention a moral theory has two aims, right? This is from Timmins and Glasgow. Again, all this is. The two aims, they say, are the theoretical aim, which we really just talked about. The theoretical aim is to discover the underlying features of actions, persons, or other objects of moral evaluation that make them right or wrong, good or bad. That's kind of what we were just trying to, we were just exploring, like what is it that makes an action right or wrong, good or bad? What's the underlying feature there? But there's also, so this would be like a criteria of what's right and good, or a set of criteria. But there's also another aim, which is the practical aim. Moral theories aren't just meant to be abstract. They're meant to help us live our lives, right? That's the point of ethics. What do we do, right? So the practical aim, the theory should also give us practical guidance on how we can arrive at moral verdicts, right? It should be able to actually help us then arrive at moral verdicts and then guide our choices. So, let's say, again, you believe in divine command theory. You believe whatever's right is right because God said that it's right. Well, that gives you, you've fulfilled the theoretical aim, which is that's the underlying feature. But also, now you just need to know what God commands in order to know what's right. So you have a sort of decision-making procedure, a practical aim, right? And a moral theory can, it could tell you like what makes actions right or wrong or good or bad, but it might not satisfy the practical aim. It might not actually be able to help you really make a decision. So that's also something that's important for moral theory. Okay, so some moral theories will take the good to be more basic. The good is more important than the right. And when we answer this question of what makes an action right or wrong, we're defining right in terms of the good, right? So these theories are value-based. They're based on if we know what's good, then we know what is right. So like in my example, buy your mother some flowers. And improves your relationship. Well, you know what's good. It's good to improve your relationship. And therefore, because you know what's good, you know what's right. You know that it's right to buy your mother flowers. So theories that are consequentialists, utilitarianism will be one. Consequentialists are value-based. Theories based on natural law, theories like virtue ethics, those are value-based. Maybe you know what those are, maybe you don't. But they identify what's good, and then they tell you what you should do based on that. But there are other theories, mainly the one espoused by, or the biggest one espoused by Immanuel Kant, called deontology. There are a number of deontological theories. But deontology, I'm not going to write it up here because I'll address it in a later video. Deontology is, the right and wrong aren't defined in terms of the good. They're separate, right? What's good has nothing to do with really, or isn't directly related to what's right or wrong. So right and wrong are based on something else, right? They are just simply moral duties. You just have duties to do certain things or to abstain from certain things. right? And it doesn't have anything to do with what's good or bad. So those are deontological theories, and the word deon in ancient Greek means duty. So they're duty-based theories. Okay, so that's roughly what a moral theory is, right? It's meant to answer these questions. It has the aim of trying to explain what makes actions right or wrong, or good, makes things good or bad, and it has a practical aim of trying to help us live our lives, tell us what we should do. And now I'm going to pause this for a minute, and then we will discuss utilitarianism specifically. If you watched the first part of this video already, you'll know what a moral theory is, and now we're going to talk about a specific moral theory called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is probably the first, well, maybe the first moral theory you would discuss in an ethics class. You would certainly discuss it in pretty much any ethics, intro to ethics college course. In my class, it's the first one that I discuss. It's very famous, also very infamous. Some people love it, some people hate it. There are still to this day adherents of utilitarianism, modern day philosophers who consider themselves utilitarians. The most famous example is a guy named Peter Singer, who maybe we'll talk about him a little when we get into this. But utilitarianism is a moral theory, and it is a consequentialist moral theory. Consequentialism is a broad category of moral theories. It's a general type of moral theory, although utilitarianism is usually the only one that people study. But there, in theory, could be there are other consequentialist theories. It's a general type of moral theory which asserts that consequences are all that matter in determining the rightness or wrongness of an action. Okay, it seems pretty straightforward. Like, if we're talking about right and wrong, if we're trying to, again, identify the features of actions that make them right or wrong, well, what happens when you do the thing? That's probably pretty important. Consequentialist theories say that what happens, that's all that matters, right? And yeah, this is like pretty basic. If I do something and nothing happens, it's kind of hard to say that it would really have any. It would be either morally right or really wrong, or morally wrong. So consequences, it's all that matters in determining the rightness or wrongness of an action. These are two features of consequentialist theories. Timmons, in the textbook I talked about last time, has some others, but these are the two that I'm putting up here. I see them as really interesting and important. The first is that it's comparative. So consequentialist theories, they don't say that there are only two alternatives in a situation, right? You might say that one action is right and one action is wrong, and the right thing is just, it's black and white. The right thing is just right, and the wrong thing is just wrong. It's wrong to murder, it's right to give your money to charity, right? Or if you're faced with a dilemma, right, there's a right thing and there's a wrong thing, and it's that simple. Consequentialists, and by proxy utilitarians, are thinking of ethics comparatively. So the right action is one that's at least as good as all of the alternative actions available. So there's a number of things you could do in a situation. The example that I thought of and wrote down on my little note card was, let's say like it's your best friend's birthday. Well, there's a lot of things you could do in that situation. You could go to your best friend's house and kick him. That would not be great, right? You could also buy him a present. You could buy him an iPhone. You could buy him a yo-yo. You could buy him a puppy. Or you could just not buy him a present. You could give him a hug. Or you could just call him and say happy birthday. Or you could text him and say happy birthday. There's a lot of things you could do. You can compare all of these things. There's not one thing that's like, this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing. There are degrees. There's a million different actions. And the right one, I guess there technically would theoretically be one right thing, but it would be whichever one is the best thing. Whichever one brings about the best consequences of all of those actions. But there's going to be degrees, is the point. there are degrees, because there's a million alternative actions, and they're all kind of on a spectrum of rightness or wrongness, I guess, right? So maybe in that case, the best thing that I could do for my friend's birthday would be buy him an iPhone. Maybe he doesn't care about material things. Maybe he just wants my affection. The best possible thing I could do would be give him a big hug, right? So that would be the right action, and I'm comparing it to alternative actions. It is also value-based. I mentioned this last time. We're trying, the central concept, those two questions in terms of what a moral theory is supposed to do, were tell us what makes an action right or wrong, or perhaps what things are good or bad. Good and bad, right and wrong are the two central categories there. So it's value-based, meaning we have a concept of what's good, that's first, and what's right is based on that. We're trying to bring about that good thing, bring more of that good thing into the world, or eliminate whatever bad thing there is in the world. We're looking to bring about certain consequences, and those consequences should be good, right? So whatever it is that's good, we're trying to bring that about. And if it's the best, if we're in a situation, the best thing we can possibly do is going to be the right action. The best thing we can do to bring about that good thing. Okay, so that's, there are many, consequentialist theories that exist or that you could devise. There's a perfectionist consequentialism, which actually I don't really know that much about, but the idea would be that human perfection, human knowledge, gaining knowledge and achieving things, this is intrinsically good. So the right actions are those in which you increase human knowledge, you increase human achievement as much as possible. That's called perfectionist consequentialism. The one, again, though, that you usually discuss, that's many people see as pretty much synonymous with consequentialism, is utilitarianism. But utilitarianism says more than this. It doesn't just say it's the consequences that matter. It doesn't just say it's comparative or value-based. It tells you what those consequences are. So what sort of consequences do utilitarians care about? The thing that utilitarians think is intrinsically good, that your actions ought to bring about, is happiness. Makes a lot of sense. Happiness is intrinsically good. We do all want to be happy for the most part. Why do we want to be happy? It's not extrinsically good. We don't want happiness for some other purpose. It's not like money, where we want money so we can buy things. It's so that we can be happy. It's not like, it's not like other things that we want. It's not like other things that we take to be good that are extrinsically good. It's intrinsically good, meaning it's just something we want for its own sake. And so it kind of makes sense that they would choose this. So the utilitarians say that happiness is intrinsically good, and utilitarianism also tells us what consequences we want to bring about, and it tells us a little more than that too. It requires that we maximize the welfare, meaning we create as much happiness as possible, of all individuals who will be affected by some action. I should say this too. This is actually important. And, sorry, it's getting a little down in the corner with the writing. Actually, this should say that happiness is the only intrinsically good thing, right? Happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically, inherently good on its own for no other purpose. And that being the case, the right actions are going to bring about, quite simply, as much of that thing as possible, or reduce, right? The other side of the coin is reduce unhappiness or pain or displeasure as much as possible. And since happiness, every person or animal even, right, feels happiness and feels pain, and that means that their happiness and their pain matters equally. So really, the right actions are going to maximize the welfare of everybody who's affected by the action. That's the goal in utilitarianism. Bring about the best consequences possible, and the best consequences are those that create as much happiness for as many people as possible. So let's dig into that a little deeper here. Let's give a little historical context first of all, and think about, I don't know, think about it some more. Let's just say that. All right, this eraser is not the best eraser, but it erases if you erase enough for long enough. Okay, so there are two gentlemen who are most associated with utilitarianism. There is our friend Jeremy Bentham, who I'm going to talk about more here today. These guys are English, British fellows in the 19th, late 18th century. Bentham comes first. Bentham is kind of considered the father of utilitarianism, although it existed prior to Bentham. He got the idea from other places, from other things that he read, but he made it famous. So he's most associated with the beginnings of the utilitarian moral theory, utilitarian philosophy. The other guy is John Stuart Mill, and I think I mentioned this in the other video, but in most ethics classes, when you talk about utilitarianism, you're going to read Mill. You won't, in my experiences, a lot of people don't put Bentham on their syllabi, a lot of instructors. And you might not read Bentham. There's a couple reasons for that. Well, I would say the big reason is that Bentham just is harder to read. He's very verbose. He says a lot of words that he might not need to say. Mill is much more readable, is much more accessible. I should put the years that he was alive. And so Mill is read more often. And you can see that Mill was a little younger than Bentham. I think Mill's father had some relationship with Bentham. I'm not like super keen on the history, but Mill was so Bentham kind of made this into a thing that people talked about with his writings, and then Mill was an adherent of Bentham. And so let me tell you why I'm going to talk about Bentham first and do Mill in the next video. Mill's little book called Utilitarianism, what he's doing in that book is responding to a lot of the at the time, contemporary criticisms of this theory. So people knew about the theory, and they had a lot of objections. They had, maybe you were already thinking of some when I put that text down there and told you what it was, and you should continue to think of some and write them down, because there are a lot of potential objections. But Mill wanted to say, like, here's why those objections don't make sense, here's why they're ill-founded, here's why utilitarianism is the right theory. So he's defending it. But he's not introducing it. So it's, to me, a little weird to throw Mill at people, and they jump in and he's defending something, but they don't really even know where it came from or know exactly what it is. Now, he does define a little bit, but I think it makes more sense to start with Bentham, think about the objections, and then see what Mill has to say and see if his responses to those objections work. So Mill will be the next video. Okay, so Bentham. Bentham and Mill both are utilitarian, so they both agree on some of these preliminary concepts. First, there's this concept of utility. Why is this called utilitarianism? Well, what is it? You know what a utility is in your house or apartment if you have one, or your parents' house or whatever, right? That's your gas and your electricity and your water. Those are things that are fundamental to you living your daily life. They're things that you use all of the time. They have value in terms of their being useful. They're very useful things. And so utility is the state of being useful. It's the state of being useful, profitable, or beneficial. That's, I think, the Webster's definition that I wrote down here. So the theory is called utilitarianism because our actions are right in as much as they are useful, in as much as they do things, in as much as they bring about consequences. So the utility in this context means the net value of the consequences of our actions. And remember, we are concerned with happiness or with welfare, either increasing happiness or reducing unhappiness, or both, actually definitely both, right? Overall welfare I'm sorry, I should have said how much, my bad, right? We need to ask ourselves, how much overall welfare or happiness would result? Right, this is the net value of the consequences of our actions, or how much overall happiness would result. And we have to consider, of course, long-term and short-term things. Taking account of the short-term and long-term effects. Short-term and long-term effects of actions and the welfare of all who are affected. Okay, so this is a lot of words, and I'm going to try not to write this many words every time that I need to write something up here. And importantly, unhappiness counts too. So this is the net. This isn't like what I wrote up here. Actually, I'm now noticing is not necessarily complete sentences, but you get the idea. The net balance of overall happiness and unhappiness. Okay, so quite a mouthful. Utility. This is what we want to maximize. We're utilitarians. We want to bring about utility, which is we're looking at all the consequences of our actions. We're seeing how much overall happiness would result. We don't just think like, okay, like my example with my friend's birthday, like I go to my friend's birthday, let's say I give him something that's going to hurt him in the long term. Let's say my friend is a recovering alcoholic and I give him a bottle of vodka for his birthday. Well, he might really enjoy drinking that vodka. He is an alcoholic after all. Short term, I'm doing something good for him, but long term, I'm really hurting him. So it's not just about the immediate pleasure, it's about the long-term effects of our actions. How much overall happiness would result, taking account of the short-term, long-term effects of actions and the welfare of everybody that's affected by your actions. And of course, you're not going to, you're bringing about happiness, but also reducing unhappiness, two sides of the same coin here. So this is the net balance of happiness over unhappiness. Let's say my friend's birthday. I buy him an iPhone. Good, all right. So that creates some utility, right? The utility is there's some good to that, right? It brings him short-term, long-term happiness, increases his welfare. But utilitarians are asking us to think about, this is important, right? Everybody who is affected. So when you buy an iPhone, you're supporting Apple, who they have children in other countries that are mining for precious metals to make the iPhones, right? And I don't know a lot about how all of this works, but when you purchase something, you are supporting you're a part of an economic scheme where there's all sorts of downstream effects of you purchasing a thing. Another example, people talk about like fast fashion. You buy like cool looking clothes that are made really cheaply and that are really cheap, right? Well, why are they so cheap? Because people are being exploited in Bangladesh or in some other country and they're working 16-hour days in sweatshops to bring you the fast fashion clothes that you're wearing. Or you could talk about animals. Like, let's say you have, a delicious steak. You're getting a lot of enjoyment out of the steak. That counts. There's some net value there. You're increasing your welfare from the steak. But what about the welfare of the cow who was slaughtered? You have to count that too, right? You have to consider all of the welfare of everybody who's affected by your actions. And then the net balance, does the happiness outweigh the unhappiness? If it does, then the action will be, on the whole, a good thing. It will have positive utility. Okay. There's a little more to it than this, though, in terms of the utilitarianism of both Bentham and Mill. They are what are called hedonistic utilitarians. I don't know if you know what hedonism is, but it's usually not considered a good thing. If you call somebody a hedonist, I think typically you're saying they only care about pleasure, right? Hedonism means having to do with pleasure. So Bentham and Mill both believe the goal is to increase happiness, and they both believe, they have a certain concept of what happiness is. For them, happiness is pleasure. They are the same thing. Being happy and experiencing pleasure are the same thing. Unhappiness is either displeasure or pain. So these guys are value hedonists, people who believe that what's valuable is pleasure and pain. And they believe, again, these are the only things that have intrinsic value. But we have to clarify this just a little bit. Because of course, this is something that Mill goes to great lengths to talk about when we get there, are the only things that have intrinsic value. Of course, like, they're not saying that, they're not saying that, like, eating a delicious steak is, having things that taste good, or having sex, or, like these kinds of or doing drugs and these kinds of base pleasures, these sorts of just purely physical pleasures. They're not saying that that is all that is intrinsically good. Pleasure for them is much deeper than that, because there are other things that bring us happiness, right? As human beings, we like to appreciate a great work of art, a great novel, or a film, or a video game, if that's your thing. Aesthetic appreciation, that is a kind of pleasure. Intellectual pleasure. I don't know if these videos are that entertaining, but if they are, you're getting some intellectual pleasure from thinking about these things and exploring deep concepts and intellectual ideas. We have aesthetic pleasures, we have intellectual pleasures. You could say, like, the pleasures of being in love with somebody. These kinds of pleasures that maybe other animals don't feel or don't feel as deeply, perhaps, those count too. And same thing when we talk about pain. We're not just talking about physical pain. We're not just talking about getting stabbed or shot or breaking your leg, right? We're talking about things like anxiety, longing, grief. Those are examples of pain, and they count, right? So when they say happiness is just pleasure, they're not saying, it's not what you think when you think of just hedonism, when you think of just gluttony and lust. Like, it's not, those are pleasures, they count, but there are deeper, higher forms of pleasure. Those count as well. Same thing with pain. And Mill's going to talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so these guys are hedonistic utilitarians, you would say. Again, these are the two big utilitarians, but modern day utilitarians. You don't have to be a hedonistic utilitarian in order to be a utilitarian, but both of these two big names, they are. And what they would say, I'm not going to write this down, but if we're talking about what makes an action right or wrong, this is directly from the Timmins book. They might say something like that, or they would say something like this. An action is right if and only if, and because, it would likely produce, if performed, at least as high a net balance of pleasure or less pain as would any alternative action one might do instead. A little bit of a mouthful, but what they're saying is the right action creates the most utility. It's the most useful, creates the greatest balance of pleasure over pain. Yeah, so if I have the choice to, if I have the choice to feed 100, go to a food bank and feed 100 people that are hungry, that need food, that don't have any money, go, somewhere into a really impoverished part of Baltimore City, I am creating a lot of welfare for those people, a lot of happiness, or alleviating a lot of pain. I can do that. I can spend my day doing that, or I can play my new video game or whatever. That will bring me pleasure. That counts, right? That's a good thing. Pleasure is good. Happiness is good. But I have another alternative action where I could feed 100 people. That's going to be the right action comparatively, right? That will create more, even if, right, it sucks and I don't like it. Even if it's hot outside and I'm hungry and thirsty and it causes me pain. My pain counts, but the 100 people who I make happy counts a little bit more. So there are, this brings us to like a really, maybe the most memorable quote associated with utilitarianism, which comes from Bentham. And he says this: "It is the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which is the measure of right and wrong." The greatest good, happiness, pleasure, lack of pain, for the greatest number. That is like the tagline for utilitarianism. You'll always hear people say, if you remember any tagline for it, the greatest good for the greatest number. That's it, right? That pretty much summarizes the whole thing. So it's the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which is the measure of right and wrong. That's Bentham. Mill says something, and he identifies what he calls the greatest happiness principle. And he says, the greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Actions are right, are more right, they're righter, the more happiness they create. They're wronger, the more pain they create or lack of happiness. And then he says, by happiness is intended pleasure, and the absence of pain; by unhappiness, pain, and the privation of pleasure. That is pretty much it. So I want to get into a little more in depth into Bentham, and then I want to try to give an example of what he calls the felicific or hedonistic calculus, that's just meant to help us. It's meant to satisfy the practical aim of utilitarianism. Remember, a moral theory has a theoretical aim and a practical aim. It's meant to be a decision-making procedure that can help us figure out what the right thing is. So I'm going to stop here, and then I'll continue with Bentham. Okay, so now that you have a basic grasp of what utilitarianism is, let's talk a little bit about Jeremy Bentham, who's considered the father of utilitarianism. He was a jurist and, importantly, a political reformer. He saw utilitarianism as a way or as a means to reform society, to make it better, to change the laws, to change the policies, right? He thought if we all thought like utilitarians, then we would have a much better society, right? This is the book that, most people will read as an introduction to his thought, as an introduction to utilitarianism, an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation. I mentioned earlier, I've never read the whole thing. It's, not something that you really need to read the entirety of to get the basic ideas. I just use this little 4-page selection that I gave the link to it in the beginning of the video. I just used that to kind of introduce his ideas. But he wrote this book as an introduction, or rather as a preliminary to developing a theory of penal law, of what do we do as a society in terms of punishing criminals? How do we deal with violations of the law? And in that process, he details the basic elements of classical utilitarian theory. What he wanted was a body of law. What he's advocating for is a body of law that's based on the utilitarian ideal. And so in that process, in all of his writings, he contributes a great deal to law, education, religion, prison reform, policing. He has things to say about all of these topics. The utility principle itself, the idea that actions are good if they create utility, which is the net balance of pleasure over pain. He actually didn't create this idea. He borrowed it from other thinkers, from other people that he'd read, but he did make it famous. So he's kind of considered the father of utilitarianism. He says directly, this is a quote, "The utility principle is this. It is that principle which approves or disapproves of every action whatsoever according to the tendency which it appears to have to augment or diminish the party whose interest is in question." In other words, if you are going to do something, does it increase or decrease the happiness of all the people involved in that decision? That is the criterion for whether the action is recommended or not, whether the action is good or bad, whether the action is right or wrong. And this is one interesting thing to note, is that the motive doesn't play in here at all. He doesn't have anything to say. Well, he does have something to say about the motives of your actions, which is that they don't matter at all. So let's say there's a child drowning in a pond. And for whatever reason, I know that if I save this child, I'm going to get a $1,000 reward. So I go and save the child. Well, for Bentham, that's a good act. I'm increasing welfare. I'm saving the child. I'm, from a utilitarian standpoint, I'm doing something good because of the consequences. It's a consequentialist theory. It doesn't really matter that I wanted the $1,000 reward. If somebody else saves the child and they didn't want the reward, the action is the same, the consequences are the same. The motive does not matter in terms of the goodness or badness, the rightness or wrongness of the action. All that matters is whether it increases the net balance of pleasure over pain. And he feels the need to say this because there are a lot of alternatives to this view. There are some of the ones that he mentioned, which I'm not going to go into great detail about what these mean, are moral sense, your basic sense of right and wrong, common sense, the law of reason, natural justice, natural equality, etc. All these things. These, he says, are empty phrases. They express nothing but the sentiments of the person who advocates for them. Utility is rooted in empirical and verifiable facts, right? We can see, we can observe that people care about their pleasure, they care about their pain, and the principle of utility actually takes account of that fact, right? It's not just rooted in sentiment, it's not just rooted in our feelings, it's rooted in the felt experience of pleasure and pain. So he says this is the very first paragraph of this book. I'm going to read it, and you'll see also, I think I mentioned this earlier, part of the reason people don't teach Bentham, but they go right into Mill, is because he writes in a way that's a little verbose, wordy, convoluted, but I'll kind of explain what this means after. This is the first paragraph. Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them to point out what we ought to do, as well as determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, and on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. Every effort we can make to throw off our subjection will serve but to demonstrate and confirm it. In words, a man may pretend to abjure their empire, but in reality, he will remain subject to it all the while. The principle of utility recognizes this subjection and assumes it for the foundation of that system, the object of which is to rear the fabric of felicity by the hands of reason and of law. Systems which attempt to question it deal in sounds instead of sense, in caprice instead of reason, in darkness instead of light. Wow, just reading that, I just mentioned that he was a little verbose, but actually that's very poetic and kind of beautiful, right? And there are two ideas there that are important to tease out. One is psychological hedonism. Psychological hedonism is a view about, it's a psychological, a view about human psychology, right? And it says that all motives, all human motives, everything we want is grounded in our apprehension of pain and our desire for pleasure. So the only thing, according to Bentham, that people want is pleasure and the avoidance of pain. That is a view unique to Bentham. You don't have to have that view to be a utilitarian. It's a view about what we are like. Human beings psychologically are hedonists. All we want is pleasure. All we want is to avoid pain. Separately from that is ethical hedonism. And this says that pleasure is the only thing that's good and actions are right as they tend to produce pleasure and avoid pain. Psychological hedonism is about what we're like. Ethical hedonism is about what we should do. It says that pleasure's good and we should try to promote it. All we care about is pleasure, is psychological hedonism, and we should promote pleasure and eliminate pain, is ethical hedonism. This is, it seems like this might be, basic or obvious or not even worth pointing out, but it actually is pretty groundbreaking. And you can there is a tradition among utilitarians up to the present day with Peter Singer, who is still alive, a modern day utilitarian. There's a tradition of challenging social norms and challenging what is taken to be common sense or moral sense. For example, think about animals, non-human animals, that is, right? We don't, we care about our pets, our dogs and our cats and everything. We don't want to hurt them. But we generally don't think or care too much, most people, about the suffering that animals undergo in factory farms so that we can eat their meat. And it's immense. I'm not going to go into detail, but you can do your own research there. We don't think that animals are morally relevant to our decision making, that we don't think that animals have moral rights, right? But for a utilitarian, you have to consider the interests of animals. Why? Because they suffer and they feel pleasure, right? Bentham said the question regarding non-human animals, the question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? If an animal can suffer, they are worthy of our moral concern. That's kind of groundbreaking, right? We tend not to think that animals have moral rights. So other issues, again, Bentham was a social reformer. He wanted to change society, make it better. He was very interested in penal law and punishment, how we treat criminals. And he said this: all punishment is mischief. All punishment is evil. What does he mean by that? Shouldn't we punish criminals? Shouldn't we punish bad people? Well, for a utilitarian, all we're doing is increasing their suffering. How does that, why would that be a good thing? Why would we want to punish somebody? Well, there are reasons, right? We do need to do something. If somebody is a criminal, there needs to be some consequence. But framed in terms of utilitarianism, that's going to look a lot different than just punishing them because it gives us some kind of satisfaction or some sense of, vengeance or whatever. Punishment for utilitarianism, or for Bentham, should be framed in terms of deterrence. We want to deter people from committing crimes. That increases utility. Disablement. We want to disable them from committing more crimes. Moral reformation. Maybe we want to try to make them better people. Everyone would be better off if that were the case. And compensation, right? Somebody who's harmed by a criminal, someone who breaks into my house and steals my stuff, they should have to compensate me in some way. But that's the purpose of punishment. Punishing just for the sake of making ourselves feel better, from a utilitarian lens, you can see how that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So this is, again, pretty groundbreaking stuff even now. So punishment should be based on the harm perpetrated. And interestingly, in 1789, Bentham thought that we should reject criminalizing sexual acts, which today there are still people who believe that we should criminalize certain sexual acts. Why should we criminalize something that has no victim, that hurts nobody, right? From a utilitarian perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So again, right? This is a tool for social reformers, and social reformers, you know, a lot of them have come from this utilitarian tradition. He also was in favor of preventative policing, right? Evidence-based crime and analysis. You don't just arrest people and throw them in prison. You try to solve the social problem to make everybody better off before you have to resort to violence, before you have to start throwing people in prison cells. Remember, all punishment is mischief. So he's a political radical. He also supported women's suffrage, a woman's right to vote, in 1789. Granted, from what I read, his relationship with that issue is a little bit complicated, but he did support women's suffrage. One of the things he's very famous for is this idea called the panopticon, which I don't think I can go into too much detail now, but it was this sort of architectural design for a prison where you would have this tower in the middle of a prison, or I think hospitals and, you know, I don't know, sanitarium, I don't know what you call, like, not insane asylum isn't the right term, but you would have this tower in the middle of the facility, and there'd be a guard who could look around at all times and theoretically see what everybody is doing. And the idea of this was to reduce, like, deviant behavior, and because people knew that they could be being watched at any time, because there was this constant threat of surveillance, people would behave themselves, and there wouldn't be this kind of violence and chaos and anarchy in a prison. So that idea of the panopticon, other philosophers took that idea and ran with it, like Michel Foucault, and you can read more about that. But it's something that he created that he really tried to put into action, and I think he put a lot of money into trying to make the panopticon happen, and when it didn't, he was really bitter and disappointed. So one more little interesting bit about him. In his last will, he wanted to be anatomized, right? Have his organs harvested. And the purpose was to publicize the benefits of donating his body to medical science. That was an unusual thing at that time, right? His eulogy was given by a physician and sanitary reformer over his desiccated remains, right? So he didn't think you die and your body is something sacred that needs to be buried properly and all of this. He thought you can do something good. You can increase the welfare of humanity with your body by donating it to science. So that's what he did. And then this part's a little weird. He also requested his mummified head and skeleton to be preserved, right, and dressed in his habitual garb, and it can still be viewed today at University College London. His head was replaced long ago by a replica, but you can go and see mummified Jeremy Bentham at University College London if you want. So, you know, he had a lot of strange ideas, but that's what utilitarianism does, right? It gives you a litmus test, a criteria for thinking about what you should do, what society should look like. That's not rooted in our sort of intuitions. That's not rooted in common sense. It's not rooted in the idea that we have these natural rights. It's rooted in what he saw as the basic facts of existence, pleasure and pain. And that is a tool that can really, really change society. So, and John Stuart Mill, his not predecessor, the next guy, right, who we're going to talk about, was also a social reformer. So how does this theory of utilitarianism guide us? Remember, we talked about the theoretical aim of a moral theory and the practical aim. Practically speaking, what are we supposed to do here? Because how am I supposed to evaluate the consequences of every alternative action that's available to me? That's really hard. Well, Bentham had a way to do this. It was called the hedonistic calculus or the felicific calculus. Felicity means happiness, so calculus that can help us figure out the amounts of happiness involved in an action. And the felicific calculus was meant to calculate the pains and pleasures expected to accrue to people, including yourself, by a given act. You can also use this if you're a legislator, if you're someone who's trying to come up with law and policy, right? This calculus will ideally tell you what the right thing to do in any situation would be. Now, it's like an algorithm, like you have to do math and all that. And we're going to try to do it. And that's how we're going to conclude this video, is trying to apply Bentham's Felicific calculus and see what happens. Bentham didn't believe that people would actually use this. He didn't think it was feasible to seriously sit and calculate all of the pleasures and pains involved in any action and all of the people involved. That would take a really long time. But we can use it as a tool, as something to think about, that will help us sort of know what the stakes are and guide us in our decision making. But there is really a calculus. In theory, there's a way that you can use math and figure out whether an action, or importantly for Bentham, a policy, is recommended or not. Okay, so let's do it. Let's explore this Felicific calculus and see if we can figure out how it works and see if it's helpful. Okay, so Bentham's Felicific, or sometimes it's called the hedonistic calculus or the hedonic calculus, is a moral calculus, a kind of algorithm that measures the outcomes of a given action and allows us to figure out whether it's something that we should do or not, according to utilitarianism. So it measures an action in terms of pleasure or pain, or a policy, right? Bentham, remember, is a social reformer, so he's concerned with how can we make society better using utilitarianism. Now, he does say, let me skip and find this quote, he doesn't think this is something that like you could really use for every decision that you make, of course. But he says, it is not expected that this process should be strictly pursued previously to every moral judgment or to every legislative or judicial operation. It may, however, be always kept in view, and as near as the process actually pursued on these occasions approaches to it, so near will such processes approach to the character of an exact one. So what he's saying is, yeah, you might not really actually go through this algorithm to figure out the policy or the action, but you should try. These are things you should consider, right? Okay, so let's actually try to go through the process and see if we can, because it's a little complicated and weird and it never quite works, but we can try to approximate it. That's what we're going to do. But first, let's figure out what this stuff means here. So these are all the factors that we would consider when we're trying to figure out whether an action is one that we should perform or a policy is one that we should enact. The first four deal with any individual pleasure or pain that an action produces. Okay, so a pleasure or pain might be intense. There's degrees of intensity, right? Eating a piece of candy, not that intense. Feels good, not that intense. Climbing Mount Everest and reaching the top, that's groundbreaking. That's life-changing. Super intense pleasure if you manage to do that. Maybe. Or maybe you are exhausted and freezing cold and not having a good time. Anyway, I digress. Duration, how long does the pleasure last? Candy doesn't last that long. Marrying the love of your life. You're married to the person that you love more than anybody. That pleasure will last a long time. These are things that matter. Again, it's not just short-term pleasures that we're concerned about. We're concerned about the overall quality of the pleasure, and these are all things to consider. Certainty or uncertainty means how certain is it really going to happen or not, the pleasure, right? Piece of candy, I'm definitely going to experience the pleasure of the candy. It's totally certain. If I'm climbing Mount Everest, will I make it up to the top? That's a little less certain. Propinquity, Bentham uses words that nobody ever really uses clearly, but propinquity or remoteness refers to like how soon is it going to happen? How far away is it? Is it remote or is it immediate? The Mount Everest thing, that's going to take a while. The candy, it's propinquitous. I don't know. It's happening immediately. Is it immediate? Immediacy, that'd be a better word for it. Okay, so that's just dealing with the individual pleasures and pains associated with an action. But in terms of the action itself, there are these two other qualities, fecundity and purity. Fecundity refers to the tendency, the chance that a pleasure that results from an action will be followed by sensations of the same kind. That basically that a pleasure will produce more pleasure, right? The candy, it happens once, it doesn't have any fecundity. That action, eating the candy, it doesn't create any more pleasure. But like maybe you're into like lifting weights. You lift weights, it feels good, right? But it also makes you healthier, and it increases your chances of having more pleasures later down the line. So that would have a higher degree of fecundity. It also could be with pain. Like a pain would have a high level of fecundity, whatever, right? Or could have a high level of fecundity. So like maybe you're not having a good time lifting weights, but it's not going to produce more pain for you. So it's not fecund at all, right? Purity. Purity is just the opposite of that. It's the chance that a pleasure or pain will not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind. So let's say you get drunk, right? Getting drunk, what are the chances that getting drunk, the pleasure of getting drunk will not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind, meaning pain? Pleasure and pain, those are the opposites, right? Getting drunk, how pure is that? Well, it will be followed by pain. You'll get a hangover. So it's not very pure because it has a high chance of not being, or has a low chance of not being followed by sensations of the opposite kind. The same thing with a pain, right? If something causes you pain, what are the chances it's going to not be followed by pleasurable sensations? So if somebody, stabs me, what are the chances that that's not going to be followed by pleasure? They're very high. So it would be that's just gonna, I'm gonna have to go to the hospital, like I got stabbed, bad stuff's gonna happen. That is actually a pure pain. The pain is pure. It's only gonna be followed by more pain. But something like lifting weights, working out, it might be painful, but that pain is not pure because there's a low chance that it will not be followed by pleasures, right? I'm even confusing myself. Regardless, you kind of get the idea. Is it going to cause you more pleasure? Is the pleasure going to cause you more pleasure, or is it going to cause you more pain? Okay. Then there's one more thing to consider, which is this is all for one person, but everybody's interests matter for utilitarianism. So then you have to do this process for every person that will be affected by the action or policy in question. And that is the extent. Maybe it will do basically the same thing for a number of people. So you could multiply this by that, but the action will have different effects on different people. I mentioned earlier, like I buy my friend an iPhone for his birthday. Well, I can say, oh, good, it's recommended for him, but the extent it affects all the people involved in the supply chain, the person who works at Apple, the child who mined for the precious metals in another place, right? So you have to consider everybody, and that's what this criterion of extent is capturing there. All right, so how do we actually go about this? If we were to go through this process to see whether an action or a policy was recommended, how would we do it? Well, luckily, Bentham gives us a decision procedure. First thing we do, this is the process. For any given act that we are considering, first we figure out the value of each pleasure that results from it. So you do something, you do all of this for every pleasure that results from the action. Then you do it for every pain that results from it. Then the value of each pleasure after the first, because more things happen. There are more, the candy gives you pleasure, but maybe you're allergic to the candy and Then there's something else that happens. There's a pain. So now you got to figure out the pain, right? The value of each pleasure after the first is the fecundity, right? And of the first pleasure, and the impurity of the first pain. The value of each, so number 4 is then the value of each pain after the first is the fecundity of the first pleasure, the impurity of the first, I'm sorry, I'm getting this mixed up. The value of each pain after the first is the fecundity of the first pain, but the impurity of the first pleasure. This is, if this seems ridiculously overcomplicated, it is. You're not stupid if you can't follow this. I almost can't follow myself here. Okay, but then what do you do? Okay, so you figured out, there's an act, you figured out the pleasure and the pain with each one, you figured out the fecundity of each pleasure, the purity of each pain, based on whether it's going to be followed by more pleasure or more pain. Then you've got to add up all the pleasures and pains together. If they are on the side of pleasure, the action is good for that one person. If they're on the side of pain, it is bad for that one person. And now you have to do extent. You repeat this process for each person. It's going to take forever. And then you get the total balance of pleasure over pain. Figure out if the action's recommended by utilitarianism or not. This isn't going to happen. You can't really do this for every moral or policy judgment. But like I already mentioned, you keep it in view. You try to approximate it. So I want you to be aware, the fact that this isn't like necessarily something that's technically possible or feasible doesn't mean it's not useful, right? And Bentham recognizes that. But just for fun, let's see what we can do here. So there were 2 examples that and I think when you go through these examples, you can kind of see how this does sort of make sense. It does kind of capture something real, even if giving numbers feels a little arbitrary. The one example I always use with my class is heroin. Heroin. Let's say it's something that and the reason I like this example is because it's something that it's bad to do heroin. Hopefully we all agree in 99% of circumstances, you should not do heroin. Heroin is known to cause a lot of problems and ruin your life and ruin your relationships, destroy your health, and maybe kill you. Don't do heroin. But yet, if utilitarianism is about increasing pleasure and minimizing pain, you would think, well, then you should do heroin, because heroin, presumably, I guess, is very pleasurable. So, take that, utilitarian. Well, I don't think it's that simple. Let's try to do this with heroin. And this is really hard to do. So I don't know if I'm going to be perfect with this. But okay, so we've got the act. We're considering whether or not we're going to do heroin. We have to figure out each pleasure and pain associated with it. We can't do each one, but we're going to try to do a couple. Let's do some numbers over here. Okay. First thing that happens when you do heroin, I imagine, I've never done heroin, but I presume that it does feel kind of good for some people when you first do it, or else nobody would ever get addicted to it, right? So let's say there is a pleasure associated with it. We're doing the first pleasure first here. What is the intensity of that pleasure? We're going to use a 1 to 10 scale, I'm saying. Let's just say that it feels great. I don't really know, but let's say it's a 10. Let's say it, okay? Just for the sake of argument, we're giving it a 10. Very intense pleasure. What's the duration? I don't know. How long does heroin last? 15 minutes? An hour? Not that long, though, in the scheme of your life. Okay, did heroin, feels good, it's over. That's pretty low. We're going to say that's like a 2. Okay? Maybe even a 1. We'll say 2. Certainty or uncertainty? Okay, you're about to shoot up. Is it going to happen? Is it certain or not? I feel like it's pretty certain. With certainty or uncertainty, one of the things I read online was that you should kind of just give it like a 0 through 1, because 1 is certain and 0 is it's not going to happen. So there's not really, I don't know, I guess we could just still do 1 through 10. Same thing, right? Okay, so we'll say the certainty, it is going to happen. It's a 10. Propinquity or remoteness, how soon is it going to happen? It's going to happen now. Okay, fecundity. Fecundity is, remember, how likely is it to be followed by sensations of the same kind, meaning pleasures? How likely is heroin going to be followed by pleasures? Well, Bentham says to figure out the fecundity, you calculate the value of each pleasure after the first. That is the fecundity of the first pleasure and the impurity of the first pain. I'm not going to do that. We're not going to do that, right? But we'll say, okay, let's just think about it. How likely is using heroin going to be followed by more pleasure? Maybe you do it again, but every time it's diminishing returns, right? It's going to feel worse and worse. And most likely it's going to stop being pleasurable at a certain point. And that's what addiction is. You have to maintain, you have to do the drug or the thing in order to just feel normal. So it's really not going to be followed by further pleasures. We're going to give that a 0 because it's not fecund at all. Purity is how likely is it to not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind? How likely is it not going to be followed by pain? It's going to be followed by pain in almost every circumstance, right? Because if you get addicted, you're screwed. Like, you now have withdrawal. Your relationships are destroyed. You have to spend all your money on heroin. You're vomiting, like you're sick. You're dope sick. It's not a pure pleasure at all. It is not likely at all to not be followed by pains. It's very likely to be followed by pains, in other words. So that's a 0. We can't really do extent yet because we've got to calculate each person to do extent. Okay, pain. So each pleasure and each pain. We'll just do, that's one pleasure, the first pleasure that happens. But we'll do the first pain. So the first pain, let's say you start to have like withdrawal. The withdrawal is really bad. We'll say that's a -10. The duration, well, the duration of getting off of a hard drug is much longer than the enjoyment of the high. So that's going to be, actually, let's do this as pain, so we won't have to do negative. We'll just, yeah, this is pleasure. The duration of the withdrawal of heroin is long. It takes a while. It's very hard for people to get clean. We're going to give that an 8. Certainty, well, maybe you could do it once and not get addicted. I don't really know how that works, but it's definitely less certain there. So we're going to give that we'll say 5. Propinquity or remoteness, how soon? It's a little further away. You're not going to get the withdrawal immediately. So we'll give that a 5 as well. So fecundity, how likely is the pain of withdrawal from heroin going to lead to more pain, right? It's very fecund. It's going to lead to a lot more pain. It doesn't, it doesn't lead to anything good, because if the withdrawal will cause you to use the heroin again, which will cause the withdrawal to get worse, you're in a vicious cycle now of addiction. It's very fecund. We're going to say 10. I'm not really sure if fecund is the right word here or not, but we're going to say 10. Purity, how likely is it to not be followed by sensations of the opposite kind? In other words, pleasures. How likely is this pain to not be followed by pleasures? It's very likely to not be followed by pleasures. It's very likely to be followed by pains. So 10. Okay, so now we can sum this up. This is one person. One person. This is not, it's under extent, but we're not doing extent right now. We're just summing it up. What is that? 32 on the side of pleasure, 35, 48 on the side of pain. Not recommended. The pain is higher than the pleasure. Whoop! Don't do heroin. It's not recommended for you. But what about everybody else affected? We haven't even done extent yet. Well, you do this again. I'm not going to do it again. How's your mom going to feel? When she sees you doing heroin, not much pleasure there. Pain immense, watching her only child or one of her children descend into drug addiction. What about the costs? Then you have to consider the costs on society. Maybe you have to go into rehab. Maybe that comes from people's tax dollars. Maybe you have to go to, there's so many things to consider. You're hurting all of your relationships, right? And then we didn't even consider down the line the intensity of, you can die, right? So like even just for yourself, like it could be worse. So extent, we're not going to do it. Imagine we did this for every person that is affected by you doing heroin. It's going to be even worse, right? So we can see, the point is, I don't really know if this is exactly how you're supposed to do the calculus. It's all a little absurd. But you can see that it does kind of make sense, because what seemed like in the beginning, oh, heroin, it brings pleasure. So a utilitarian, would say you should do it. Take that, utilitarian. No. The utilitarian, based on this calculus, would say doing heroin is a very bad idea. Not just for yourself, but when you consider extent, all the pain that's going to cause, it's bad. So it captures what is a real moral intuition about heroin. I'm going to do one more example, because Bentham, again, is a social reformer. He's not necessarily that concerned with individual actions, but with policies. This is a way he thought that we could, the correct way to devise social policies. So let's take something like universal health care. Pretty popular in America. There are some who oppose it. It's widespread in a lot of other developed countries. The idea is, in America, we have a private insurance market where you have to purchase insurance from, a private business, and it costs a lot of money, and it only covers certain things, and they often will try to jack up the prices on your medication, or, people, it's America, the United States of America is somewhat notorious for injustice in the healthcare system, or what is perceived as injustice. So many people support universal healthcare. This would be where the government provides healthcare, and it's not part of private industry, right? The government provides it. Of course, you have to pay taxes to the government to provide this, but everybody gets healthcare. Nobody has to worry about not affording their insulin or anything like that. Now, it is contentious. There are people who many people who don't support universal health care. We don't have it, right? So clearly, politically, it is a hot button issue. But let's say we want to decide whether or not we should have universal health care. Okay, well, let's take one person who's affected by this. Let's take somebody who doesn't have health insurance and is sick, and they have diabetes and they need insulin. Okay, universal health care, how does that affect them? Well, it's very good. I mean, you could say it's pleasurable that they now have health insurance. They have it for their whole life, hopefully, but, I guess something could change. We'll just give that I mean, the numbers are not totally arbitrary, but, there's a level of arbitrariness here. How certain is it? Well, some people say the quality of the healthcare wouldn't be as good if we had universal health care, so maybe they wouldn't get the treatment they want, but most likely, assuming we can sort it out, we'll say like there's a 9 there. Propinquity or remoteness. Well, okay, so if Congress passed a law, it would take a while to go into effect. There'd be a lot of steps. You don't really know how soon this would really help somebody. So we'll say that we'll just kind of estimate that at like a 4. Fecundity, okay, if it passes, is that likely to lead to future pleasures for the person? Yeah, they'll continue to have the health care. So I don't know. I don't know. I'm going to say an 8. Purity, how likely is it to not lead to pains for that person, the person who didn't have health care? We'll say it's not likely to lead to pains. Of course, maybe there are things we can't predict that it makes their health care worse. I don't know, right? There's a lot to consider here. And what I'm doing now is a really, really sad, bad approximation of how you would really do this if you were a policymaker that needed to consider all of the important factors. But we'll say it's pretty pure. It's not likely to cause them pain. So that on the whole, that's pretty good. What kind of pleasures what kind of pains does it cause the person? Well, it doesn't really cause them any pain, which doesn't last any amount of time. The pain is, how certain is the pain? Well, there isn't any, so I don't know, right? There's no pain, so it's uncertain. How far away, I don't even really know how to do this exactly. There's no pain associated with it. There's no pain. we're going to say there's no pain. Maybe there's something I'm not considering here. But clearly for this one person who doesn't have health insurance, right? Oh, you know what? Let's, I just thought of something. If it's coming out of our tax dollars and it's universal, it comes out of everyone's tax dollars. So maybe there is a little bit of pain. Now they have to pay for this service. Okay, so we'll say that there's like a 2 intensity of pain. It lasts a long time because they have to continue paying this. It's certain it's going to happen. So this dramatically changed, right? Propinquity, well, I guess it depends on whether the policy passes. Fecundity, whatever, right? Purity, it's a pure pain. It's likely to continue because it's taxes. This is all nonsense to some degree, but you see what we're getting at. Sum up these numbers, sum up these, for that person who doesn't have health insurance, whatever, the point is, whatever problems, whatever pain it causes them, for them it's going to be really a good thing. Extent, you could just take this number, multiply it by all the people who don't have health insurance or have crappy health insurance, and you get a lot of pleasure, a lot of welfare for people. But there are people theoretically who would be negatively affected, right? Some people say in terms of healthcare, right? I like my insurance. I have really good insurance. I love my doctor. If there were universal healthcare, I wouldn't be able to choose my doctor, right? I would lose some of the benefits of the current insurance that I pay for. So you could say for some of those people, there'd be some pain involved there. Again, for everybody, there's going to be some kind of tax structure that's could, hurt people's pocketbooks. Although you then have to compare it to the policy of continuing to have private insurance, which also is very expensive. So, you could calculate all the bad things that could happen for all the people, all the good things that could happen for all the people that it positively affects, weigh it up, figure out the extent, figure out if it's recommended, right? I'm no policy expert, so I can't resolve that right now. But the process would be complicated. You couldn't do it in a 30-minute, in a whatever, however long this video is, segment on utilitarianism. But that's the kind of thing that you would want to do. And what's really interesting is there are other ways to approach this issue. And that is what Bentham is rejecting. Let me give you an example. Rights. The idea that we have natural, imprescriptible rights. It doesn't matter, and that would be the basis of your moral framework or your political framework. It doesn't matter on that view that universal health care might benefit a ton of people and that the welfare that is created would outweigh the pain that is caused, because people have certain rights. There are certain things that you cannot do to people no matter what the outcome. One of those things might be the government can't tax me, take the money that I earned from, let's say I work really, really, really hard, I make $500,000 a year. The government's going to take a percentage of that from me, stealing my labor and giving it to some poor guy on the street who doesn't work so that he can afford his insulin, right? Yeah, that would really benefit him, but that's not fair. That violates my natural right. The government is stealing from me to create this outcome. It doesn't really matter that it is the recommended action from a utilitarian point of view, because I'm not a utilitarian, right? This character that I'm playing is not a utilitarian. I believe in natural, imprescriptible rights. You can't violate those rights. There's certain things the government cannot do. That would be one way of opposing this on non-utilitarian grounds, opposing this type of policy. Bentham, that's what he's railing against in this whole book. He says that natural rights are nonsense on stilts. Rights only make sense if they protect our interests, or rather, rights only make sense as sort of like a proxy for what really matters, which is the overall balance of pleasure and pain. Rights by themselves, right, they're nonsense on stilts. There is no such thing as natural rights. You don't have some inalienable right that the government can't tax you, right? If taxing you is going to make so many other people better off. So, you know, there's one question in terms of healthcare, like, would it be the best utilitarian outcome or not? But there are also other things that people, other justifications people use for opposing a policy like this, or for supporting it, right? You could say, I have a right to healthcare, and that's something that is just owed to me and that I should have. It's not really about the overall welfare. The policy should uphold and preserve my natural right to have healthcare, not have to pay for it, right? Bentham is just going to reject all of those because he's a utilitarian. He says utilitarianism is really the ultimate sanction of right and wrong, of what should or shouldn't be done in terms of our own decisions of whether or not to use heroin, whether or not to buy our best friend a present or give him a hug, whether or not to climb Mount Everest, or in terms of policies, whether or not to have universal health care, whether or not to have the death penalty, or whether or not to legalize abortion. All of these questions can be viewed through a utilitarian lens. This kind of allows us to approximate that. And for Bentham, for utilitarians, should be viewed for that lens, because that viewed through that lens, because that is the ultimate sanction of morality. So that's all I have to say about Bentham. People will often not talk about Bentham, and they'll go straight into Mill. I'm going to talk about Mill in the next video, the part 2 of my utilitarianism talk. But for you, before you watch that video, I want you to do a little bit of homework. It's just in your mind, or write it. Better yet, write it down if you can. Strengths and weaknesses of this theory. What is appealing about it to you? Try to articulate to yourself in your mind or on a piece of paper what works about this. What are its strengths? I kind of mentioned some already, which this is an incredible tool for changing society and helping us see through our biases, right? And that's why a lot of these utilitarians were social reformers and were really progressive for their time. It gives us a tool for kind of cutting through the BS, right? Do you see any other strengths of this theory? Does this seem accurate? Does this make sense of the moral landscape of our lives? In what ways does it make sense? And then more, I don't want to say more importantly, but also, which this might be easier for you, I haven't pointed out any of the critiques of utilitarianism. I've been very careful not to kind of spoil the next video by telling you what a lot of the common criticisms of the theory are. So how would you critique this theory? That's part 2. What's good about it and what's bad about it. Is there anything that seems wrong with this theory? Are there any problems with this theory? Does this theory lead to bad consequences for people? Does this capture your moral intuitions about right and wrong? Is this an accurate description about what makes an action right or wrong? Is this theory an accurate description about what is intrinsically good or intrinsically bad? Namely, happiness. Namely, for Bentham and Mill, pleasure in the absence of pain. Are there other things that are intrinsically good that they are leaving out? Is there something else? Are there other criteria that are needed to figure out what makes an action right or wrong, or whether an action is right or wrong? Does this satisfy the theoretical aim of a moral theory? Does it accurately explain what makes an action right or wrong? Does it satisfy the practical aim? Does this actually help us make decisions? And are there situations you can imagine where this really doesn't work, where this really seems to lead to situations or results that are clearly immoral, maybe? There's a lot to think about. And where we're going to go next time is we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, and what he does is he jumps right in and he starts saying the critics of this theory are mistaken. and he deals with a lot of the objections that you're probably going to think of, and it'll be really interesting to see how he deals with these objections and whether utilitarianism can stand up to the criticisms. So that's all I've got for this, and I look forward to talking about Mill next time.